You're listening to CRM Audio, the Microsoft Business Applications podcast, with Business Applications MVPs Joel Lindstrom, George Dubinsky, and Sean, the CRM Hobbit Tabor. This episode is brought to you by Dynamics 365 User Group. The Dynamics 365 User Group community is powered by users for users and specializes in the delivery of member-driven education, networking, and events to help you maximize your current Microsoft Dynamics investment. And if you're not registered yet for the Dynamics 365 User Group Summit in Phoenix coming up in a couple weeks, you still have a chance. Go to crmugsummit.com to register. In this episode, we talked to Merwan Hade from the Microsoft Flow team about all the exciting things you can do with Microsoft Flow. But first, here's a message from George and Dave.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here with none other than David Yark.
And see, I thought you forgot my name already.
I kind of, when I look at you, I kind of, mesmerized with all the knowledge that coming out of you. So we're here at Ignite 2018. How many people here?
It's like 30,000, they said.
They said 30,000. It's Ignite plus Inspire. Envision. So there's lots and
I'm
lots
just
of
trying
people.
to not be trampled by all the people.
Fighting for beer or soft
Well,
drink.
the problem with beer is it doesn't open till 5 p.m.
Yes. Anyway, I hope we won't have the same problem when we run masterclass.
Toronto and Colorado.
So Toronto is coming up. It's 4th and 5th of October.
Yep.
And Colorado the week after that on 10th and 11th of October. So if you haven't registered yet, then...
discount codes.
We've
got two of them.
Wait a minute. So if you haven't registered yet, the easiest way to get is to go crmtipoftheday.com/masterclass, and then you'll find the separate links for Toronto and Colorado to register. So if you City Slicker, go ahead and pick Toronto. If you're more into Rocky Mountains and what do you have? Bears?
Bears.
Yeah.
And Dynamics and Power Platform.
We've got lots of news to talk about.
Well, the October release is happening, so we've got all kinds of new stuff.
Yes, we will get our hands on some of the new stuff. We'll walk you through the new stuff. Anything exciting that's going to happen in October that we're definitely going to talk about?
Well, a lot of the solution packaging is, I think, really interesting and going to change a lot of things. But there's really a whole bunch of stuff we're going to be talking about.
Okay, so check out the agenda, register, and we do have a couple special codes to celebrate Ignite. We have 2 codes per city. So Ignite Toronto and
Ignite Colorado.
So here you go, and you get 10% off straight off the bat. So by all means, come to crmtipoftheday.com/masterclass, pick the city of your choice and register, and I'll see you guys there.
Welcome to CRM Audio. We are coming to you from the official Microsoft podcast booth at Ignite. This is exciting. We're in the immersion zone. Do you feel
I feel subsequently immersed.
And we have a special guest with us, Merwan Hade, who is a senior program manager on the Microsoft Flow team. Hello, Merwan.
Hi, Joel.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
And we talk regularly about Flow. It's now a very important member of the Microsoft Business Applications family. And we're really excited about what's right around the corner with things happening. For example, being able to put Microsoft Flows inside of Dynamics 365 solutions. I think that'll make it a really first-class citizen, if you will, in Dynamics deployments. So, what we wanted to talk about is, what is the real ramification from your perspective? How are you going to handle it? We had Evan Chalky on yesterday. We talked about this from a Power Apps perspective, but from a Flow, I've got flows that have 4 or 5 different connectors in them, and so how are you going to handle that if we are moving, between 2 environments, or if an ISV who makes a solution that they sell puts a flow in their solution? how are you going to handle those reconnections to those services?
Yeah. So I'll start off, first of all, by just explaining kind of the purpose of solutions. I think the first thing, as I'm sure Evan mentioned, is that it's a way to wrap up your dependencies into a single package.
Right.
So your dependencies in terms of apps, in terms of workflows, as well as in terms of entities in the common data service.
Okay.
It's really one encompassing solution that allows you to tie in the dependencies between them, then move them from one environment to another.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing that it's useful for also is for solutions where you want to parameterize things and just reuse them across deployment. So, for example, let's take SharePoint as an example. If you were going from one site to another, it allows you to build a flow that can just be retargeted by parameterizing certain things in the flow. And then the third thing, as you pointed out, is for ISVs. So you build a solution that you can then distribute and people can consume. Now, in terms of connectors, the idea is that when you start a new solution, when you instantiate a new solution, you're going to have to bring in your own connections. So you have to say, okay, the flow will say I use, let's say, CRM, SharePoint, and let's say Outlook 365. When you go in and use that solution, you're going to have to bring in the connections for that particular flow in that solution.
So what if I have a send email step, for example, and it sends email from a specific account? That account doesn't exist. Is that flow going to be in a draft or unpublished state until I fix the missing pieces and then I republish it?
That's correct, yes. So
that's not going to stop the solution from coming in. It'll bring it in, and then that'll just be, to get that piece working, you'll have to go in and manually change it. That's
correct. So you'll have to, by default, the flows will be off. You'll have to go in, make sure all the connections work. In fact, when you go from one, especially when you go from one tenant to another, environments, by and large, it depends on how you've set it up. You probably will have the connections. But if you're going from one tenant to another, certainly you're going to have to bring in your new connections. Mm-hmm. You might have to change certain things because, for example, as you would know, for Dynamics or SharePoint, the schema is dynamic. And so you might need to make some tweaks to the flow itself to make sure that it runs depending on what it's targeting.
Okay.
So what's the long-term plan to do that? Let's say I'm bringing a solution with 10 flows, right? So and they're all 10, I don't want to use this term, but they're broken, right? Mm-hmm. So I need to go and fix one by one. To me, like within the ALM practice, that's no better than just moving 10 one by one, right? So what's the long-term plan? How are you going to solve this problem?
Yeah, so I think where we can kind of add value as you're going from one environment to another is by allowing you to parameterize and define in your flow what are things that will change between those environments. So then you can just take it, export it, change the parameters, and we'll have like a PowerShell story as well because we know people do this at scale, and then bring it into each of those environments. So parameterization is definitely going to be a key experience. It's not going to be there in the V1, but it's definitely on the roadmap because we know that people are going to want to do this, on a broader scale.
So the parameterization, is that going to be? We talked a little bit about this, but I was thinking about it. Is that going to be like a configuration entity or page inside Dynamics that you can specify parameters that will be then set parameters inside the flows?
Yes. So we're still figuring out the exact experience, but yes, the idea is that parameters will be essentially entities in Dynamics, and you'll in the flow you'll define what these parameters are, and then there'll be an experience where those parameters will map to entities in a table.
Okay. So what is the future with the connectors that come out of the box? How many do we have right now?
I think we have close to 220.
Okay, that was growing really fast for a while. Then it seems like it's been around 210 to 220 for a while now. Are we going to see a number of new services coming on there in the future?
Absolutely. So the history there is that initially we started building the connectors ourselves. So about the first 150 or so connectors were built by Microsoft directly.
Okay.
We now have a rich ecosystem of ISVs that are building in their own connectors. So the last 70 or so have been brought in by ISVs themselves. And so that's why you'll see that the rate has slowed down a little bit, because now that the market is seated, we're turning to ISVs to go in and build the connectors themselves.
So with the ISV connectors, can anybody build a connector to anything and publish it out there, or what is required to get a connector actually listed as an official connector inside of Flow?
Yeah, so kind of the first requirement for building a connector is that as that ISV, you have to own the underlying service. So we don't currently allow people to go in and build connectors for other companies. So I'd say that's the first requirement. But after that, just bring in, you basically write a Swagger spec or an Open API spec, and you just submit a connector. We go through a certification process. We test your APIs, make sure that they run, and then you can go in and publish it.
So can I just flag? Sorry, you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, the flow, if I may say so, in the current model. We just started to using Flow as kind of workflow, not replacement, but kind of complementary, and to talk to third-party systems. And so far, it's working great. But what we do find that vendors who own the APIs, in a lot of cases, what they do in those 200 connectors, they just kind of put the foot in.
Right.
They put couple actions, maybe couple triggers. Yep. And they certify it, and they kind of done, and they can say, we have the flow, right? The flow connector. The best example, the last one we tried to use was MailChimp. And it's got like one trigger and I think 2 actions. So it's certainly not sufficient to do anything useful.
Right.
And as ISV, I would love to come in and create an API, maybe free, maybe monetized, but because create a connector, but because I don't own the API, I won't be able to get certified, right? How this story is going to change, because there is no currently incentives for vendors to get a full coverage for the API, right? And for me as ISV, I just can't do it. Even if there was incentive, and there is incentive, the only road for me is to actually publish private connectors,
right.
Client to client to client,
right.
Which kind of not going to scale and not going to work for me. So what's the long-term story here? How are you going to help people who don't own the API but they have capabilities to build connectors? How are you going to help them out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's still something that we need to kind of work through and figure out a model where we can appease these ISVs that don't own the APIs. But I think one thing I'd say is that we'd encourage working with someone like MailChimp. If you can get their permission, if you have some kind of contract or something where you can get visibility from them, get their act that you're enhancing their connector. I think that's definitely something that's kind of workable. I think where we run into issues and the reason why we've adopted this policy where you have to own the API is because of legal constraints. Right. Essentially, we don't want to be in a situation where the underlying service has an API that is being used incorrectly, or we have somebody who makes a mistake with the API they're providing, or somebody does something malicious accidentally. We don't want there to be liability on the original underlying service, and we sort of want to steer clear of that. So I think as long as you can get certification or some kind of contract with the underlying service. Then there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to work on that.
So
there's really more
if I approach,
than,
I understand. I totally understand. On this scale, we certainly need to get some clearance and sort of legal boundaries. So if I as a vendor approach, say, MailChimp and say, hey guys, we're creating this cool thing, do you mind? We already probably created private one. So we show them and say, do you mind? And if we get like clearance, let's say, MailChimp says they certified whatever that means, and that should be okay with Microsoft to publish.
Absolutely,
as long as we get legal clearance. That's interesting.
Have you given any thought to a potential partner program for Microsoft's key partners in terms of Flow that could help foster that interaction, right? To where you have an official kind of partner program with standards and such that partners like ourselves could join with the various companies, Adobe and all our critical Microsoft business partners. That might be a mechanism to help encourage the growth of those connectors.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we haven't actually formalized anything like that yet, but we are working on a more formal ISV program where we reach out to ISVs, and there's a broad spectrum of things. I mean, connectors being a big thing, solutions being another big thing. Eventually, we'll start to run into things like apps and controls, etc. And so I think as part of that grander vision, I think this would definitely be something that would fall along the lines there. But at the moment, we don't really have any such kind of formal program where we'll work with ISVs and introduce them to these other larger service providers. But definitely something for us to consider.
Have you had to make changes to some of the connectors? I'm thinking like the social networking. For example, Twitter. Every Twitter client I use now prevents you from posting to multiple accounts at the same time, and things like that. Facebook now restricts scheduling posts on your personal account, things like that, some of which were driven by abuse scenarios and that sort of thing.
And Russian networks.
Yeah, and Russian people hacking our elections. So have you had to make adjustments in how people can use some of those Flow connectors?
Not so much on our side, but I think we, as far as possible, we do stick to the policies set out by each of these connectors. So we make sure that as a platform, when we offer up these APIs to our customers, we're within policy of what's set by those providers. So I'm not sure if we specifically did anything for Facebook or Twitter, not to my awareness. But I mean, as far as possible, we stick to their policies. I know that, like, for example, when we're working with Twitter or Facebook, there are certain rate limiting that they subject us to, just to make sure that we're fair citizens in their ecosystem.
How do you determine, getting back more closer to the business applications side thing, how do you determine which fields in Dynamics can be worked with through the Dynamics connector? I'm thinking there's certain fields, when you get down into the weeds, there's certain fields that you can't read and update. There's not that many, but there are still a few getting down into the Yomi field or
Right.
that type of thing.
Customer?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, customer is the big one.
Exactly. How is that prioritized? And I've had cases where we tried to do a flow and we couldn't do it because the field wasn't available through the connector. If people have feedback like, oh, we really need this field, like the customer field, and we can't update that, or how do they get that feedback to you, and how do you prioritize those requests?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the quickest way and the most effective way to get us feedback is by going to our ideas forum. So the PM team, our program management team, we're actively monitoring the ideas forum, and as people upvote it, we definitely take it into consideration. I think
but here's the question: is do I go to the ideas forum for Dynamics, since it's the Dynamics connector, or the ideas for Flow?
I'd say go into the ideas forum for Microsoft Flow.
Okay.
That's really where we've gotten a ton of feedback. For example, take Planner as an example, or Microsoft Teams. We got a ton of feedback for Teams saying that, hey, we want triggers for when people are mentioned or when a new member is added to a channel. And it took us a few months, but we just rolled that out a couple of weeks ago.
Okay.
So I'd say, the ideas forum is really an effective way to put out your ideas, get people to to upvote them, and really get it going. I think the other thing I'd also say is that, feel free to reach out to us through Twitter, for instance.
Okay.
All of us have a Twitter presence, and we're actively monitoring feedback. And it's a great way to get in touch with us and tell us what are the use cases, why something's not working, and we can definitely work with our teammates in the Dynamics org, people that are working on the Dynamics connector, and try to unblock you.
They
So
probably
you can
probably
write.
shouldn't create a flow to email you once every 5 minutes or something.
I was going to say send a tweet every day about the idea that I have.
Repost it. So from a initial learning perspective, Flow is very intuitive, but I've found that coming from a Dynamics 365 background and knowing the workflow like you do, I find that I do this with Power Apps as well, I tend to overthink how to manage the flow, and I run into issues, and then I have to go away for a while before I get angry. So from your perspective, looking at the new Flow user, have you found that users that are not related to Dynamics 365 in their past have an easier time adopting Flow as opposed to someone that is entrenched in solutions
And workflows.
and workflows and the like.
Yeah, I don't know if we've really seen that distinction as much. I think for us, the way we've seen it is that if you essentially understand what process you're trying to build using a flow, like if you understand how the data is flowing, it makes it much easier. Like if you understand your Dynamics entities and you understand what you're trying to do with them, if you're trying to, for a given, let's say, account, are you trying to get the customer and then send an email to them, or that. If you understand the relationships between the entities and you understand how the data is flowing between them, I think that makes it a lot easier. We haven't necessarily seen a distinction between what service you're using, whether it's easy or not, but it's generally just your understanding of the process.
My experience is that it's pretty intuitive and easy to approach, but there's certain operations. I think approvals is a good example. The approvals functionality is my favorite feature inside Flow.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of working on that.
Yeah, it's awesome. And doing things that used to take a lot of heavy lifting to do.
Right.
But when you get into the weeds of it, it's easy to kind of lose your way sometimes, just because, okay, now it's approved, now what do I want to do? And that's where I find the templates are extremely helpful, because if you can, what I tell people is, if you don't know what to do, find a template that's close and then look at how it's built, and you can a lot of times figure that out. But as we develop more and more flows, and we have great ideas, what's the process for turning a flow into a template? Like if we say other people would benefit, how do you vote on that, or how do you decide from your submissions what becomes a template and what doesn't?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. So, when a template is submitted, we review it, we check whether it's unique or not. And if it is, we'll go ahead and publish it. But I think the one other thing I'd suggest is, once you've built a flow, if you can tweet at us or put it on the community forum, just kind of give us a heads up, like, hey, here's what this does, here's why it's useful. That would definitely help expedite things and getting it in.
Okay. And
one other thing I was going to add as well, I think templates are definitely a great way to get started. I think Flow of the Week is a tremendous resource as well.
Yeah.
So Flow of the Week, what we generally do is when we have customer interaction and customers tell us about a particular use case where somebody was struggling with something, we'll take that issue and we'll create a Flow of the Week out of it, so that we can try to unblock people. And a lot of times we're encouraging our authors to include a zip to the solution as well, so you can just download it and instantiate it in your tenant. So I'd say that's another big area. We're working on how to make it easier to discover information, because it's between Flow of the Week, it's in our documentation, we have guided learning as well. So we're definitely working on a better search experience, but I'd say Flow of the Week is definitely another great place to look for patterns.
okay.
So when I start development within the Dynamics, and I go and select processes, and I have 4 to choose from, minus dialog, so I have 3 to choose from, and we have certain guidelines for people, which one to choose, whether you choose action, whether you use business process flow. Then we go to asynchronous versus synchronous. Now some users accidentally started see they shouldn't be seen, like immersive flow selection. I think it happened this week by accident, and it's been kind of database being upgraded, but so it surfaced in UI, but there is nothing happening. But it's coming in October, right? So there will be 5 choices for people. So what guidelines we can give to the users, to creators, to makers, call them what you like, to developers, when to use flow versus workflow versus action, and so on?
Well, I mean, I think I'll start at the top. I'm not as familiar with all of the various workflow technologies you mentioned, but I'll talk about flow versus business process. The distinction I draw is, think of flow as a workflow management tool. So you're connecting to different services and you're moving data between those services, right? There's no real human intervention per se. Approvals, yes, that's where you need an approval, but by and large, you're moving data from one service to another. I think of business processes as a place where you need somebody to take interaction. It's a guided experience. You're going from one screen to another. You're taking some inputs. Those inputs get persisted. And yeah, you might make some API calls along the way, but it's basically driven by human action, human intervention versus being automatic. So I think I'd start at that level as the first distinction.
Yeah, I understand with the business process flow. Let's set it aside because it's to me it's a guidance. It's not. It's kind of prescriptive guidance rather than workflow. More fair to compare it. The closest one would be asynchronous workflow that currently lives inside Dynamics. It's kind of. And let's say, consider the example, and I'll come back to this example. I want to send a birthday emails or something like this. It's actually quite challenging to do that within the Dynamics and do it properly with it. But let's say I have a task to send birthday emails to my customers. And so which one would I choose? Would I choose Dynamics, asynchronous workflow, or would I choose Flow? So where do I draw the line, which one to choose?
I mean, I'd also say, part of it also just stems from your experience, right? Whatever you're more comfortable doing. I'd say, in this case, for example, if Flow provides an easier experience for you, if there's less friction in getting started, in connecting to different APIs, and I think certainly Flow is the way to go. Like, depends on the medium that you're connecting to as well, right? If you're just sending an email, I think it wouldn't matter as much. But if you're, for example, posting on Twitter, or you're, sending them a text message, for instance, or you want to give them a robotic call, you can use a connector like InfoBip. I think it just really depends on your use case and what you're trying to do and what tool you're familiar with. I think we find that it's easier getting started with Microsoft Flow, but it really just depends on your past experience.
Yeah, I think the things that orchestrate things in the system, like when this happens, update this field or set the name of the record. There's a clear case to be made for using workflow for that, because it's especially synchronous real-time workflow. It's real-time. It happens immediately when you save the record. For the things, if you're doing things like the notifications, I am so sick of email notifications and so sick of the emails loading up, considering that I can do push notifications and I can do text notifications and just expand the type of notifications I can do.
You can post to Teams, you can post to Yammer.
That's the exception. That and approvals are the two things that I put the exception to. You can do it in the box of Dynamics. You always use workflow. I think you should use Flow for that. I'm also becoming a big fan of the buttons, the Flow buttons, because there's some pretty powerful scenarios you can do where if you have a user needs to do an action where they answer a prompt or submit some text, take your email for the birthdays or something, I want to control when that happens on a given day or something like that. Giving them a button they can push where they can enter a personalized message or something, that's something that is a much better and richer experience than the run-on-demand workflow experience.
Nothing would make me more lonely than getting robotic voice call on my birthday. Happy birthday, George.
That's why we have the Flow button that puts a personalized message in it.
So speaking of sending birthday emails, I just came across this morning the post that says how to do birthday emails using Flow. And the essence of it was basically in Dynamics it's challenging because you've got birthdays, so you need to drop the year and so on and so forth. The essence of the post was how to you format the date using months and day, and then you compare the strings. So which is great. But the one thing this post got, from my perspective, horribly wrong is that as the first step, it said, let's select active customers and then loop through active customers and then check if their birthday is today and then send them email, which works nice if you've got sample data with 25 records. In any real scenario where you could have, hundreds, thousands, millions, and tens of millions of customers, that's going to be a liability. So, which brings me, from developers' perspective, Flow is great because when it reaches its capabilities and needs a bit more management in ALM, I can export it, import into logic apps, and control it. If that happens in logic apps, what I just described, it's kind of be my guest. You paying for every single interaction, right? So in Flow, you own the environment.
That's right.
So what you do now, or what are you planning to do to combat these rogue flows that's going to hog the system, your system? You own the environment. Microsoft does. So what are the challenges there, and what you're planning to do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you pointed out a great kind of distinction wherein on the logic apps, it's kind of your own thing. You're paying for it, whereas with Flow, we're managing it. Today, we don't have a hard and kind of set policy of how flows are. If you have runaway flows that are taking up a lot of CPU power, or they're just getting a lot of data, we kind of look at it on a case by case basis. A lot of times we do have flows that will have like a circular dependency. That seems to be a pretty common thing, and we'll turn it off and we'll message the customer. But it really just depends on a case by case basis. So we're still formalizing what it would mean. I think one of the things that we're working on. So I think I'll say that we still need to figure out what happens when you fall into this scenario. What we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how to avoid putting you in this scenario. And so we're working on this experience called Flow Checker, which we'll roll out in the next few months, wherein we're going to start to look at your flow and identify patterns. So for example, if we notice that you have something like, let's take SharePoint as an example. When an item is modified, or that's your trigger, and then you say update item, that's going to put you into a circular loop. And we'll detect that and we'll say, hey, if you're trying to do something like this, have a flag that, create a column which you can then use to check whether this is a recently updated item or not. So I think that's something that we're trying to do to make it preventive. What happens when you're already in that scenario? Today we kind of look at it, we see what's going on, we'll message the customer and turn it off. What happens in the future in terms of throttling, etc., I think that we still need to figure out and formalize.
And that brings up an interesting question, because George is exactly right that you build something for a demo that looks really cool, but then you grow up and scale it to hundreds of thousands or millions of records. It doesn't scale. And so the question is, how do you identify, or where is that dividing line between where flow is okay or we should use a logic app? What advice would you give to people?
Yeah, so a general rule of thumb is if you're an Azure developer, if you have an Azure subscription, then Azure Logic Apps is the way to go. If, for example, you're an Office 365 or a Dynamics 365 customer, then Flow is the way to go.
Okay. But, there's a point with that, from a scale perspective. How do you determine when you should consider moving a flow to a logic apps, or a scenario that whether you're in Dynamics or whatever, how do I know this will be good for flow versus I should use a logic app?
So, one thing I will say though is that flow is built on top of logic apps. So you get the same reliability, the same scalability that you would get with logic apps in flow. The difference is that depending on which license you have, for example, your polling intervals might be different. But we don't actually, in terms of scalability and reliability, all of that, our SLAs are identical, just because Flow is built on top of logic apps. And so the difference comes into, for example, polling intervals is one thing where it might be different. Now, a lot of our connectors use webhooks, so it doesn't really matter. Quite a few of them, the majority of them, have polling. So, for example, in Flow, you can have either 15-minute checks, you can have 5-minute checks, or 3-minute checks. Where on the logic app side, it's more immediate, where you get to define the frequency, and you can go down to as little as 1 minute. So I'd say, in terms of scalability and reliability, no difference between the two products. If you want faster polling, logic apps might be an option. In terms of the connectors itself, by and large, the same between the two products. Logic Apps has a few that are more geared towards integration specialists, things like DB2. They have things like SAP, etc., that require an additional license. But by and large, the two platforms are identical. They use the same workflow designer. They use the same runtime as well. So it really just depends on what, basically which billing model makes sense for you, paying per run or paying by license. And also just what tooling are you more familiar with?
Okay. Another question, what about on the security and governance side of things? I want to control, in an enterprise company, I want to control that you can use Flow with environment A but not environment B. And I want to, and you're a member of both, and I want you to use connector A, B, and C but not use any of the other connectors.
Yeah.
What control does an enterprise company have over that?
Yeah, so Flow has this concept of data loss prevention policies, or DLP policies, wherein an administrator can go in and classify connectors into two groups: business data only and no business data allowed. So for example, in business data only, you'll put in things like Dynamics 365, you'll put in Outlook, SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, and any of the services that are meant just for your business data. You'll put everything else into the no business data allowed category. Now, once you've done that classification, it can apply to either the entire tenant or specific environments within that tenant. And what happens is when the flow gets created, so for example, if you use connectors that are in the business data only category, you'll be fine. Or if you use connectors that are in the no business data allowed, you'll be fine as well. But the moment you cross that boundary between the two data groups, you'll instantly get blocked. So for example, if you create a flow that says, hey, when there's a new customer in Dynamics, post it to Twitter. It'd probably be an insane flow, but you want to prevent people from creating a flow like that. And so as soon as they attempt to kind of save that flow, the user will get a message saying like, hey, your administrator has set up a policy that blocks the movement of data between these two connectors.
Okay. And then in the outside the enterprise realm, I think Flow is fantastic. I have multiple flows that I use, but I find that in my quest to automate my personal life, that I have to use several other services, and specifically the one area I find that other services like IFTTT have that Flow doesn't is connectors to personal IoT type devices or personal assistants, Google Home, Alexa, other things like that. So if I want to do real cool things like make new commands for Alexa, that type of thing,
or Cortana, given that we are a Microsoft
and there's
company.
And I find that some of the personal Microsoft services actually work better with things like IFTTT. Like if you want to work things on a personal OneDrive and things like that, there's a couple of other connectors. So it's obvious that Flow is geared towards business and business applications, but there's also personal uses for it. You start using it, you want to automate everything. So is there a focus on bringing any of those other services in there as well?
Yeah, I'd say, you're absolutely right. Our focus thus far has definitely been on the enterprise. That said, though, we know just from data that we do get a lot of usage from people that are using it outside of work. So we support both Microsoft accounts, MSAs, as well as work accounts, and we see a healthy usage from non-AAD accounts, non-work accounts. And so from a connector focus, enterprise will still be a big part of what Flow does. But we do see in the future bringing in more connectors from outside. We can't disclose a whole lot more, but there is things. We are kind of looking at the home automation space and how we can bring the power of Flow and workflows into the home automation space.
Right, and like the home automation, there's a lot of home uses, but there's also cases where ISVs may want to package in things to give their users the ability to do voice commands or enable Alexa and Google Home scenarios with Dynamics and SharePoint and other business applications.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Our focus has sort of been, as an ISV, if that's something that you want to build and you own the service, going back to our earlier discussion, we'd absolutely be supportive of bringing in a connector, having templates for it. We are starting to. One of the big connectors that's I think it's already out there, if not coming soon, is IoT Central. So, for example, in Azure, if you have a bunch of devices that you're managing through the IoT Central service, how do you build automation for it in Flow? So I'd say, definitely, with kind of the industry and everybody adopting all these home automation devices. That's definitely going to be a focus for the Flow product in the coming months, as certainly in the coming year.
Yeah. One of the things, going back to the enterprise, one of the things I've noticed with some of the standard Flow deliverables, like in approvals, there isn't an ability to customize that like you would a custom authentication page and in other products, things like that. Do we see a time when we'll be able to make that kind of, customization?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, I can speak to approvals. Certainly, that's definitely a goal for us in the next, in the coming 6 months. We want to make it easier for you to send your own custom approval notifications, use your own branding and what have you. Still use a workflow platform, approvals platform in terms of an approval center, which has all of your unified received, sent, and history of all of your approval items, will allow you to do more of your own thing. So at least for approvals, that's definitely a big priority for the next few months.
Well, since we're back at the enterprise, I wanted to ask you kind of, for the benefit of listeners, I know a bit about that, but for the benefit of listeners, it's kind of flow inception. So to administer flows, what flow tools do you provide to administrators? So what's available there?
That's a great question. So we have an admin center, the Flow Admin Center, which allows you today to see, set up data loss prevention policies. As an administrator, you can see all of the flows in a given environment, who owns them. If necessary, you can go in and add yourself as an owner. Just this week, actually, we released a preview of the Power Platform Admin Center, which is meant to be a single unified center for Power Apps, Flow, and Power BI, wherein you can get analytics of flows across your environment. So you can now start to see things like what are the flows, what kind of triggers do they use? Are they button based? Are they schedule based? Are they event driven? Which ones have succeeded or failed? And coming very soon, we'll also have this ability to dissect it by connectors. So you can see, hey, is Twitter being used in my organization? Okay, if so, what are the flows that it's connecting to? Are they being used in the right way or not? So we're making a concerted effort to give you more visibility into how Flow is being used. The other thing I'd also say is that we released PowerShell command lists in the last few months, and one of my colleagues, James Olenek, did a talk this morning at Ignite, which I think is definitely worth checking out, where he talks about all of the various commandlets that are available for both administering Flow as well as Power Apps. So you can do things like export them between environments, you can turn them on, turn them off, add people as owners, and so forth and so on. So there's a rich volume of things that you can start to do.
Is there a connector for me as admin to say, when user creates a flow, please send me an email?
Absolutely. There are connectors. There's a Flow admin connector. There's a Power Apps admin connector as well, where you can do exactly what you just said. So somebody creates a flow, you can say, oh, is it by a certain user? Is it using a certain connector? And so forth and so on. You can get an alert.
And then we can get mechanical device slap.
All right, we need to wrap it up soon. I think you had one more question.
Yeah,
Sean.
one more question. I've noticed that given the prevalence of Flow in all of the different Office applications, it's really creating a common thread throughout all of the Microsoft 365 experiences. Do you find, or have you gotten feedback that enablement is providing different experiences for Dynamics, whereas before we would say if you go outside of Dynamics, it's a bad thing, right? Everything needs to be in Dynamics. Whereas now through Flow, you have these external connections. You have connections within Office 365 that are more robust than we had before. It isn't necessarily when you send an email that it's got to be an email activity necessarily, right? That kind of thing. Is that a part of making that whole Microsoft 365 experience intentional, or is that just happy?
No, I mean absolutely. I mean I think I think where we do try to shine is through the strength of our Office 365 and Dynamics connectors. And being able to connect to all these different services and moving data between them is definitely a concerted effort. And as you'll see, from our connector lineup, the Microsoft connectors, we do spend a lot of time and effort from them, and that's where we see usage and traction. So it's definitely an intentional thing, and I'm glad it's resonating.
Yeah.
One last question that I have. I noticed that you've got Apple Watch, right? So I don't have one. Yeah, and Sean just in my face, right? So I just wonder, is it possible, I'm just curious, is it possible to publish a Flow button that shows up on the watch and I can use it to start Flow, or to push the approval or something like that?
That's a great question. So we do have a widget in iOS where you can start buttons. So you can't do it from your Apple Watch quite yet. But you can launch buttons certainly from the widget in iOS. being able to do approvals via quick action, that is on our backlog. So you know, in the near future, you'll be able to do an approval directly from a notification when it pops up on your watch.
Because that's how you sell to CEOs, right? So, you can approve $10 million right here on your wrist.
Absolutely.
All right, well, Merwan, we really appreciate you joining us and filling us in on all the exciting flow happenings. We're all super excited. Super is the word of Ignite, right? Everybody's
Go with the flow.
Super excited. So go with the flow. Thank you, Merwan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
This has been CRM Audio, the Dynamics 365 podcast. Send us your feedback at voice@crm.audio. Check out our other shows at crm.audio or subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and any place else podcasts are offered. This podcast is a production of Dynamics Podcast, LLC.